certainly appreciate the folks of you that have joined us today. This looks like it's going to be a very popular topic, and we appreciate the National Aquaculture Association and the United States Aquaculture Society co-hosting this meeting, along with help from the Alabama Cooperative Extension System and Auburn University. By my official atomic clock here, it is 9:58, so we'll give folks just a couple more minutes to get started, and then I will turn it over to Craig and let him run the meeting. And if you have questions, please type them into the chat box to the hosts.
I say we get started. First of all, welcome everyone. As David said, first off, I want to thank the National Aquaculture Association and the U.S. Aquaculture Society and the Auburn Extension Service for putting together and hosting this webinar. My name is Craig Watson. I'm the director of the Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory with the University of Florida, and aquaculture, animal welfare issues have been part of my career for the last 30 years. And the intent of today's meeting is to be an informational session about what's going on in this topic and what direction the aquaculture industry may want to look at going moving forward. So we're going to have three speakers. I'll give a little bit longer introduction to each of them later. I'm just doing the introduction and setting the ground rules for the webinar. A couple of miscellaneous housekeeping things. One is you're going to hear a word anthropomorphism in some of the presentations, and it's in our policy with the National Aquaculture Association. And basically that is the attribution of human characteristics to or behavior to a god, an animal, or an inanimate object. And that's an issue with welfare of animals. Anyway, just that's the definition. For question and answers at the end, and we're going to try to leave as much time as possible for that, use the chat button, and if you would, just send it to the host. Don't send it to everybody, and that will allow us to go through those, and as the presentations are going, to pick the best questions to bring forward at the end. This webinar will be archived on the USAS website. If you go to their website, there's a whole series of webinars that have been archived. And we do have a hard 1-hour deadline for the whole thing. So with that, the three speakers that are going to be featured today is, first, we're going to hear Dr. Ben Diggles. Ben is in Australia and has been very active in animal welfare for recreational fishing, research, and most recently with crustacean welfare. He owns a company called DigsFish Services that has put out some pretty good extension publications. Ben, because of the time change, the time zone that he's in, has pre-recorded his presentation. And I don't know that Ben is going to be able to join us live. It's a little after midnight where Ben lives tomorrow. Then we're going to hear from Howard Browman. Howard is a principal research scientist in Norway and has been very active as well with fish welfare issues in Norway and also other places in the European Union. He is the lead author of a recently published paper that is essentially the title of his talk. So we're going to hear from Howard. And then finally, Dr. Randy McMillan, who is Vice President of Clear Springs Foods, probably the largest trout producer in the world in Buhl, Idaho, is going to give a presentation. So with that, I'm going to get off and let David Klein start Ben Diggles' presentation for us.
So thanks to the National Aquaculture Association for inviting me to speak here today on the webinar on aquatic animal welfare. My name's Ben Diggles. I'm director of a company called DigsFish Services in Australia. I'm an aquatic animal health specialist who in recent years has moved more and more into also dealing with aquatic animal welfare issues. I'm here today to give you an update on the welfare of aquatic animals in Australia, the status of where we're at, and including an update on welfare issues. First, some definitions. What is aquatic animal welfare? I mean, there are functions-based, nature-based and feelings-based definitions of the welfare of aquatic animals. None of these are necessarily right or wrong, but only some of them have a scientific basis. And definitions based on the function of the animal, the physiology of the animal, and how the animal may exist in nature. These are all things that we can measure with the scientific method, while the feelings-based definitions, fair to say, probably haven't got a strong scientific basis at this time. As far as definitions are concerned, I like this one from Arlinghouse and Schwab. Fish welfare means taking due account of the potential impacts of our actions on the well-being, health and fitness of fish, and acting in a way that minimises the supposedly negative impairment. And there's rising public interest in welfare of fish and other aquatic animals worldwide, but that's mainly in the first world westernised countries at this time. A bit of background on overseas precedents in the field of fish welfare. In 2004, voluntary catch and release recreational fishing was banned in Germany and later also in Switzerland. And that decision, it's fair to say, was based on this suffering-centred, feelings-based fish welfare concept. And it's been promoted by the animal rights and liberation movement. So it certainly wasn't a science-based approach to the issue. Tournament fishing bans in the same countries were based on the same premise. Other things we've seen in recently in the last 10 or 15 years is in aquaculture, mainly salmon farming worldwide, where the industry has been investigating various ways to improve harvest methods, humane harvest methods. And over this time, the industry, by and large, has moved away from asphyxiation or carbon dioxide infusion of the water to dispatch their fish, moving towards more a stunning approach to stunning the animals with or without anaesthesia, followed by bleeding. And this has improved product quality, shelf life, etc., but also the physiological welfare industry. It's fair to say now, today, we're in a new world. We're in the Anthropocene. Animal rights activists are now moving their interests into the suffering of wildlife, and that's now including wild aquatic animals, both fish and shellfish, as well as other animals in zoos, aquaria, and of course aquaculture. And when you look at a lot of these campaigns by groups such as World Animal Protection, World Wild Animal Suffering Research, they're saying the problem is huge. They want people to donate now. So these are true campaigns, fundraising campaigns by these animal rights activist groups, and people need to be aware of the motivations for this area. So the non-government organisations are now also campaigning against fishing and aquaculture industries worldwide. And as an example, we have the meeting in the European Parliament this year where they all talked about fish welfare and sat around and had a lovely vegan lunch. And the problem here is the welfare definitions that are being used are the ones that were developed for domesticated terrestrial animals. And in reality, they're actually not compatible with the predator-prey relationships that underpin the natural function of ecosystems that support the wild fisheries that they're targeting. So, for example, how do you balance the welfare needs of a predatory fish against those of the prey fish that they're eating? So they're sort of questions that arise immediately when you look at this area. And the other problem here is the scientific literature on welfare of most aquatic animals. And by aquatic animals, I'm talking about fish and crustaceans. This literature is very immature. It's leading to information voids and misinformation that's being exploited by. Now, the outcomes from the non-government organisation and activist campaigns to date in the area of fish welfare, it's fair to say that they're mostly animal rights style and motive campaigns rather than true welfare-oriented interactions with industry based on science. And some examples in Scottish salmon farming recently where they're being exposed to misleading or inaccurate statements about their activities. And this is a reason from the advent of the internet and the explosion of information and misinformation and social media in westernised countries. And it's fair to say these are urban, highly urbanised populations. They're disengaged from the natural environment and not really familiar where their food comes from. So these people are easily swayed by emotive campaigns. And in Australia, for example, you know, a lot of people probably think Finding Nemo is a documentary rather than a cartoon, and you have people now going out trying to feed wild sharks and wondering why they're getting their hands bitten off and things like that. So they're actually just not aware that sharks do love you and care for you, but they just hug with their mouths. So we also have some scientists advocating for the definition of pain in fish and invertebrates to be adjusted to allow them to be included in under fish welfare legislation. And this is really equivalent of moving the goalposts and lowering the scientific crossbar for pain definition if we're looking to include fish and particularly crustaceans under the welfare definitions, because crustaceans are bathyal arthropods and they're actually more primitive in evolutionary terms to insects. So I like this little cartoon down here where the ants have been keen observers of what's been going on in the scientific literature, and they're thinking even they might be in with a chance now as being included under the welfare definition. And of course, the field in itself, a lot of the science is being strongly driven by small numbers of individuals, and it's not the usual sort of more, how would we say, balanced scientific process. Now I'll talk to you a little bit about the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy. In Australia, we've been looking at these issues now for quite a while, and in 2004 a national welfare strategy was developed to provide the world with appreciation of the animal welfare arrangements we have in Australia, and to also identify areas for future improvements for the welfare of animals in the country. So that started in 2004, and it actually ran until December 2013. During that time there was an aquatic animal working group, and they took a pragmatic science-based approach towards fish welfare. They didn't even consider a fish pain related direction on the work that they were doing. That was far too contentious, and you end up going nowhere anyway, because the way it's very hard to measure any of those sort of metrics in any science-based approach. Also, invertebrates were not considered for similar reasons, and also the fact that invertebrates there's no need to consider them under the legislation. So the Aquatic Animal Welfare Working Group identified 4 sectors under the aquatic heading, and that was commercial fishing, recreational fishing, aquaculture, and the ornamental aquarium industry. The working groups provided an aquatic animal welfare framework for each sector to help them meet the challenges faced by those working in aquatic systems or using it for commerce or recreation. So they developed overarching principles, welfare principles, and the overall aim within the aquatic sector was agreed to be one to minimise suffering of the animals from capture to dispatch within the constraints of the practices inherent in that subsector. So various resources and science were developed. So the resources were developed based on some scientific work and review of the literature. Operational codes of practice were developed for each sector, and actually a large number of outcomes arose from the strategy, and they're available at the link there at the bottom of the page. Now the fisheries, one example of a project that was developed for the fisheries and aquaculture industries was the Humane Killing Project. This is one that I was personally involved in. We called it the Ectothermic project, and it was promoting best practice humane killing methods for finfish using the Ectothermic method. And it would the premise for selling this to industry was to improve not only the welfare of the animal but the product quality, the quality of the fish that you end up eating as a consumer. So it was targeted towards recreational anglers, but also commercial fishers and aquaculturists. We developed various resources, including later on a website at ikijimi.com, and a series of phone apps that interact with the database on the website. So the emphasis on the whole process was on education, extension, which is called outreach in North America, and being transparent about this issue of humane killing of fish. Now, as part of the project, we did some scientific work, x-rayed a lot of species of Australian fish, but also fish that occur around the world. And as part of the database, it's worth noting for the audience here today, it includes 53 species from North America, and there's certainly room for adding more US species to that database. We'd love to collaborate with people in North America if they could help us develop. We need a little bit of funding to do the x-rays and to update the databases. But if you are interested, then you can contact me and we can collaborate. Just moving on to crustaceans and other invertebrates. For the oars strategy, the crustaceans were specifically excluded due to no evidence for the need to consider them under Australian welfare legislation. But recently, these days, we've been seeing activists advocating for crustaceans to be included under welfare legislation. I know in Australia, but I also hear overseas as well. So in Australia, this was highlighted by a recent activist campaign against shrimp farming in relation to the ablation of the eye stalks of broodstock shrimp, which down here are the black tigers, Penaeus molodon. Now, there's various problems with that. The first problem is only a very small number of broodstock are actually ablated, and none of the animals that are ablated are actually the ones eaten by consumers. Every broodstock that's ablated produces many millions of shrimp larvae, and the larval shrimp are the ones that are eaten by the consumers after they grow up. And when the industry, we looked into this, the alternatives to ablation required use of many more broodstock to produce the same number of eggs, which would have obviously increased the number of animals in captivity, and also much more handling of the broodstock was required, because when the animals weren't ablated, it was very hard to identify the males and the females in the tank. And overall, the industry felt that a move away from the livestock ablation would result in a net reduction in the welfare of the animals. That was one problem. The second problem was crustaceans. I think I've talked about this before. They're a basal group for the arthropoda. So they're more primitive in evolutionary terms than insects. So the question was, if we include crustaceans under the welfare legislation, do we need to actually include insects in the welfare legislation too? And from a scientific basis, you would probably have to say, yes, why would you discriminate against one and not the other? And the third problem, of course, is the question, is the eye stalk ablation actually painful, in inverted commas, as claimed by the activists? And so moving on from that, review of the science relating crustacean welfare was undertaken by me as part of an investigation of conditions associated with the welfare, assessing the welfare of shrimp and other crustaceans at a national research facility. So this was an independent review, and from looking at the literature, we found no scientifically valid evidence that crustaceans can feel emotions like pain. The claims for pain, when we looked at literature, were based on a few disputed studies where the nociception was not confirmed, laboratory artefacts occurred, all variables that influenced the results were not fully controlled, and interpretations of the results were questionable or contradictory. So that has been published, that review, in the ICES Journal of Marine Science. It's also free access, and we encourage you to download that and have a read. Just moving on briefly to ideas for aquaculture moving forward. We're seeing this around the world more and more. I think the industry needs to debunk myths or misinformation when it arises in the media. For example, the reporter versus reality documents that Scottish salmon farming industry have had to put out. If you don't do that, your social licence to operate will be gradually undermined, and the industries need to be promoting accurate science-based messages on aquatic animal welfare issues via trained spokespersons and via your mainstream social media. So you need to get proper messages out there, educating the public, emphasising why your industry does what it does. This helps with the transparency, understanding, and develops consumers. Obviously, you need to continue research to improve survival throughout the production cycle. This business as usual, because profitable aquaculture requires good welfare as a default. You need those animals in good condition at the end to have that harvested product worth the money that you've put into it. Optimising water quality, stocking densities. These are all improving food conversion ratios. These are all aquaculture 101. We all know this, but it's about projecting this to the public. But obviously, if you're improving the health of the animal, anything that reduces disease can increase the welfare of the animal. Humane dispatch is important. It maximises product quality and shelf life, and obviously animal welfare. Develop best practice guidelines within your industry. But the main thing that I'd like to leave everyone with is you need to get on the front foot and be proactive. Leave no information void if you can avoid it, because otherwise the activists will exploit them. So thank you very much for inviting me to present at this webinar.
Let's get going then. Okay, thanks for having me. And the title of my talk is here, and the outline of what I'm going to talk to you about today is briefly aquatic animals that are regulated, mainly in research here in Europe, but also elsewhere. What's driving the focus on welfare? Ben said a few words about that in his talk. I'll reinforce that. What is driving the focus on sentience, consciousness, and pain? The arguments that are being used to support the view that aquatic animals are sentient, conscious, and feel pain and suffer. I'll say a few more words about the pragmatic versus feelings-based approach to aquatic animal welfare that Ben alluded to. And then I'll say also a couple of words about where things are here in Europe as opposed to Australia. Well, they're pretty much in the same space. And then I'll finish with some recommendations for aquaculture. So what aquatic animals are regulated? This table refers to regulated in research, but there's a close connection between which animal groups are regulated in research and which end up being regulated in terms of farm animals or aquaculture animals. So this is why it's relevant. And you'll see that cephalopods, so squids and octopus, are regulated in some countries, as well as decapods, so crabs and lobsters and crayfish. And in Norway, even honeybees are regulated. So the list and the kind of taxonomic groups that are covered by the regulations is increasing with time, not surprisingly. So the interest in welfare is reflected in, at least in the research community, in this Web of Science search for the search terms welfare and fish. And it's on the x-axis. It'll be hard to read, but it's just year going back to 1978 and through 2019 already, and the number of articles published per year on the y-axis. And those numbers are 140 and 160. So you see the exponential increase in the number of research articles that come back from a Web of Science search for welfare and fish. And this is tied to, in both directions, with the public's interest in the welfare of farm animals, which is reflected in this graphic from a survey by the American Humane Association, where the question was asked, how concerned are you, the public, about farm animal welfare? And 95% said they're very concerned. So, so basically, that's an important driver. It's a feedback between producers and the public. And, of course, another driver is the link between improving welfare to produce a higher quality product. In terms of the same approach to searching for pain in fish, it's a similar kind of exponential increase, again, with the year on the x-axis and the number of articles, research articles published per year on the y-axis. And again, you see a very large increase in the number of research articles on pain and fish. And what's driving that? Well, this was also alluded to by Ben, but it's worth repeating. It's really quite important. It's driven by the regulations. So the capacity of an animal to experience pain and suffering forms the basis of the current legal regulations governing how its welfare is handled and how it's euthanized and slaughtered. And this is in most of the OECD countries. Taxa classified as sentient are considered able to experience pain and suffering. And the push is on to basically consider most animals sentient. And therefore, research on aquatic animal welfare that is intended to inform the regulatory process about what particular animal groups or species to include in the regulations or not include in the regulations must provide evidence for or against the existence of sentience, pain, and suffering. And that's a huge driver for research, as you can imagine. So sentient animals that are in our care, so on a farm, for example, or in an aquarium, must be provided with comfortable conditions that optimize their health and welfare, and they must be euthanized or slaughtered as quickly and painlessly as possible. In practice, this means that the animal must be rendered unconscious and insensible, eliminating the possibility for pain, distress, or suffering until the moment that it is killed. So here you see in the regulations the importance of determining or trying to determine whether a particular animal group is conscious, sentient, therefore able to feel pain and suffer. So you can also probably think that there are some intractable aspects of this. And these are that sentience, consciousness, pain, and suffering are all very difficult to define and to measure and quantify, even in humans. And therefore, it's even more difficult, and one might even say impossible, to measure and quantify them in fish or crabs or lobsters or shrimps. And so it's reasonable from that perspective to ask whether this is a reasonable, practical, and applicable approach to address welfare in aquaculture. And I'll come back to that in a few slides. So some of the main arguments following on from this in the debate about consciousness and pain in fishes and invertebrates go as follows. So the comparative anatomy benefit of the doubt argument goes like this. It's possible that fish and crabs, lobsters, shrimp, scallops, oysters, whatever, have central nervous systems that can produce something equivalent to pain. That's the benefit of the doubt argument in a nutshell. And the problem with that, as Ben also alluded to, is that it's not scientific because it's impossible to prove that it's not correct. An analogous benefit of the doubt argument about the behavior of animals goes like this. The behavioral responses of fish, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, scallops, oysters, whatever, in response to stimuli that would cause pain in humans are signs that these organisms also feel pain. And this is, again, highly interpretive and basically impossible to prove incorrect, and therefore not really scientific. So those are some of the arguments that are used to support, that's the kind of line of reasoning that's used to support the position that we should extend aquatic animals the benefit of the doubt in order to avoid the possibility that we're causing pain and suffering to millions of purportedly sentient beings. So why this is not scientific, I tried to encapsulate this with this slide. So if we say the hypothesis one is that these animals do not feel pain, then you set out to prove that they do, which you might be able to do. It's possible. The alternate hypothesis, which is the benefit of the doubt approach, states that they feel pain, and then you must prove that they do not feel pain, which is impossible, essentially impossible, and therefore it's not really hypothesis testing, it's not scientific. So in terms of how do we follow on from this about recommendations for aquaculture, these are really, I think, consistent with Ben's recommendations. Apply a pragmatic rather than a feelings-based approach to welfare that focuses on objectively measurable welfare indicators such as behavior, physiology, growth, fecundity, health, and stress. And this is similar to what's called animal-based measures applied to terrestrial farm animals. And then emphasize the win-win reality that everyone benefits from keeping aquatic animals in a high state of welfare during holding, husbandry, and throughout the slaughter process. And consumers are already demanding this, in fact. And this is also something that Ben alluded to. And assist rather than oppose, assist in developing evidentiary-based welfare legislation and regulations that consider and weigh the animal as well as the impact on humans, both those producing the seafood and those consuming it. And that's a food supply issue. So in terms of what's going on in aquaculture in Norway and in Europe in general, particularly for fish, but also for crustaceans, is that it's emulating welfare and slaughter practices that are applied to terrestrial farm animals, both in terms of attempting to find these indicators of animal health and welfare state and applying large-scale slaughter techniques, as Ben also alluded to, at the point of slaughter, such as the image on the left, which is an electrical stunning system that's used for salmon, and on the right, a percussive stunning system that's used for salmon. So what these do is they meet the requirement of the regulations for rendering the animal unconscious and insensible until the point that it's bled out and dies. The image on the bottom is a device called the Crustastun, which is purportedly doing the same thing for crabs and lobsters. Yeah, it stuns them, and then they're killed when they're unconscious. Of course, assuming that they could be conscious. As you were informed at the beginning, this talk is a very brief summary of a review article that was recently published in the ICES Journal of Marine Science with a number of articles, and it's available freely for download. So if you're interested in pursuing of this further, please go ahead and read that. And that's all I have to say, and I'll be available to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And I just want to start off by talking a little bit about the biology of fish. And when you look at the biology of fish, you'll find that they are really quite remarkable animals. They originated about 500 million years ago, and they are the most primitive of all vertebrate animals. And yet globally, they represent about 50% of all existing vertebrates. And there's an estimated 30,000 different species distributed globally in most aquatic habitats. Clearly, fish are highly variable and adaptable, and because they are so primitive, and with this amount of diversity and variability, it's no wonder people's general knowledge about fish biology is limited. They are cold-blooded or ectothermic vertebrates. Unlike birds and mammals, whose body temperature remains relatively constant, a fish's body temperature varies depending on water temperature. Temperature is, in fact, a master factor for fish because it affects all physiological processes. All their various physiological functions must be relatively flexible, accommodating, and adaptable to whatever water temperature they are exposed to. That means their metabolism, their digestion, their feed conversion, their immune system, and the neurologic function are significantly influenced by water temperature. What is remarkable is that fish can thrive at various temperatures within their general range. If you look at rainbow trout, they appear to grow best, this is from a farmer's perspective, at about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. But they can thrive at temperatures as high as 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and certainly at much lower temperatures, perhaps around 43 degrees Fahrenheit. The significance of this to fish farmers is that the rate of growth will vary with temperature. So rainbow trout raised in water subject to seasonal temperature variations are perfectly adapted to those changes, but their time to reach a harvestable size will be slower. This doesn't mean that there's a welfare problem, but it does reflect the biological flexibility of the trout having evolved under variable environmental conditions. The water medium itself presents some unique challenges. Water is 800 times more dense than air, 50 times more viscous than air, and the diffusion of gas in water is about 8,000 times less than in air. This impacts how fish move, how much energy they must expend to move, and how they exchange oxygen or carbon dioxide. The process of natural selection can be observed in that fish have swim bladders for neutral buoyancy and mucus on the skin to reduce drag in the water. The water also creates some advantages for fish over terrestrial animals. Because fish live in this relatively dense aquatic medium, they do not need to fight gravity the way terrestrial animals must. The amount of oxygen that can be dissolved in water is primarily temperature dependent. The colder the water, the more oxygen can be present. After water, oxygen is the primary limiting factor for fish. If there's insufficient oxygen, there will not be enough energy for fish to power the biochemical machinery in cells for body maintenance, growth, movement, reproduction, or disease resistance. When we consider how to provide conditions good for growth, for fish growth, one of the first considerations must be dissolved oxygen. That these animals can thrive within water's physical and chemical constraints is remarkable. Why fish can thrive so well is partially attributed to the fact that both gills and skin are important organs for gas exchange. Even adult fish, up to 30% of their dissolved oxygen needs can be obtained from across the skin. In some fish, such as demonstrated here, for carp and goldfish, the gills themselves can be remodeled to conserve energy when oxygen is abundant, or to enhance oxygen uptake when oxygen is low. What's really interesting from a biological perspective is this remodeling is reversible, and it can occur in 3 to 7 days being exposed to a particular environment. Even though fish are the most primitive kind of vertebrate, they are anatomically remarkable. Fish have a unique lateral line organ that enables them to essentially touch from a distance. In essence, a hydrodynamic antenna. The lateral lobe, shown in this slide as a red line, and right here, and visible on the side of the rainbow trout, right here, lateral line on a rainbow trout extends on up into the head, around the eye, and as demonstrated here, under the mouth. So the lateral line is a flow-responsive mechanoreceptor on the body's surface for the detection of water motion relative to the body. The lateral line plays a critical role in a variety of behavioral contexts, including prey detection, predator avoidance, communication, and navigation. It enables fish to locate objects in space, whether stationary and inanimate, or moving and alive. It is why fish do not run into walls or dams, and alerts them that something is coming towards them, perhaps to eat them. It is why fish align themselves into a current and can reduce their energy use by slaloming between vortices. It's why fish in schools can respond in a coordinated way. Fish in a school need to sense their environment with high accuracy, maintain awareness of their position within the school, and respond quickly to changes in both water currents and movement of the group. It enables the school to respond rapidly to predators. All these behaviors occur automatically because of the lateral line and occur in the absence of visual cues or the need to think about their actions. Also unique to fish are the Mauthner neurons. These are large nerves that go along the side of the fish, one on each side of the fish. So they're two giant neurons. They originate in the midbrain of the fish and extend down along each side of the body. These two neurons receive multiple types of sensory inputs, including sight, sound, and hydrodynamic inputs from the lateral line. A special feature of these particular neurons is that they are command and control neurons. When activated, command and control neurons evoke a naturally occurring involuntary escape behavior. They are essentially decision-making cells that cause an involuntary startle response, propelling the fish away from a threatening stimulus or even toward a prey or food. There is no conscious or emotional component to the response. It is important to understand that fear is not required for the response to occur. So I mentioned these anatomical and physiological features to illustrate several things. Fish have a unique biology that is very different from terrestrial animals and particularly different from birds and mammals. Fish physiology is relatively plastic and can perform quite well under a variety of environmental and production conditions. From a fish performance standpoint, some conditions are better than others if the goal is to increase muscle mass as fast and efficiently as possible. But because one situation results in faster growth than another does not mean the slower growing circumstance provides less welfare. It is simply a reflection of the biology of the fish as it adapts to its environment. How fish have thrived over millions of years through cataclysmic events and environmental shifts of various sorts is a testament to the success of their basic biology. Fish have automatic and innate responses to various stimuli, including threats, and this makes good evolutionary sense. Fish do not live communally, where one fish is looking out for the safety of another fish. If an individual fish does not respond to a threat in real time, they will perish. A fish, just as any other living organism, must first not be eaten, then they must eat something, and then they must reproduce. If any of these things fail, for example, if a fish is distracted by pain, they would be eaten. If an emotional attachment to another fish existed in the wild that caused it to delay action, that fish would become a meal. If you are a carnivorous fish, you're going to eat your smaller brothers or sisters. Fish farmers, when observing fish behavior, really need to know what that observed behavior means. Fish have all sorts of receptors that detect various chemical, physical, and noxious aspects of their environment, and these receptors can induce behavioral changes. For example, certain amino acids activate both olfactory and gustatory chemosensors, which stimulate the feeding responses. Very small changes in carbon dioxide concentration are detected by sensors on gill arches that reflexively increase ventilation. Behavioral responses to something are an important tool we can use to manage our fish, but we must understand, but we must understand what, what, how, and why behavior occurred. We need to recognize that behavior itself is subject to natural selection, and there must be real biological reasons for it, rather than some sort of emotional attribute we wish upon them. With that in mind, it's valuable to consider Tinbergen's 4 questions. Tinbergen was a scientist a number of years ago. He looked at behavior in animals and recognized that there was a propensity for humans to apply their beliefs onto animals when interpreting behavior. And he recognized that was a mistake. So he identified a number of questions that people who look at behavior need to consider. What events inside and outside the animal cause it to behave as it does at that moment? How do experience and genetic makeup combine to cause the animal to behave as it does? What is the behavior good for? How did a behavior evolve? What is the survival advantage of that behavior? And I found it really helpful to remember that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. except in the light of natural selection. Species-specific aquaculture conditions and practices that provide for good fish welfare have, out of necessity, been scientifically determined over time. And while these practices continue to evolve, they are based on real, quantifiable biological measures. It is important to understand that a fish farmer's fundamental motivation is to ensure the health and well-being of their animals. In part, this arises because they do care about living organisms. Many are motivated to provide safe, quality food to a growing human population. They are also motivated to provide good husbandry, because if they don't, their livelihood suffers. Diseases are an integral part of the existence of all animals, including cultured and wild fish populations. Most often, disease occurs through the interaction of environment, pathogen, and the host. Compromised environments or host, or both, increases the probability for disease, since pathogens are almost always present. From day one, U.S. fish farmers are taught about the critical interaction of host, environment, and pathogen. We learned a long time ago that an ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure. Once fish get sick, it is awfully difficult to cure them. In the U.S., we are further challenged by the lack of federally approved drugs to treat fish disease. And besides, some customers are requiring that fish that are cultured need to be done so in the complete absence of antibiotics. Disease prevention is the best tool we have. It is in our best interest to promote good fish health. So we routinely monitor a variety of water quality parameters and adjust our management efforts accordingly. In addition to water quality monitoring, we monitor fish health, feeding, and carrying capacity of the aquatic production system. We have instituted robust biosecurity programs and rely on good veterinary care. Many producers have an effective vaccination program. But the same interactions and factors I just identified for fish health management apply equally to fish bioenergetics. In the US, feed accounts for about 50% of our production costs. And as such, we strive to ensure every ounce of food goes to a good purpose. Feed or energy consumed by a fish is used to meet the metabolic demands of existing tissues. That energy can be directed to growth of muscle, or it can go to other things like reacting to pathogens or ensuring physiological disruptions are taken care of. This is commonly called the fish's energy budget or bioenergetics. So this energy consumption equation identifies all the ways energy is used or partitioned by a fish. Energy goes to basic metabolism, day-to-day activities like swimming, food processing or the specific dynamic action, loss of energy in fecal matter and urine, or the production of flesh or eggs and sperm. Food fish producers focus their attention on the rate of energy allocation for somatic tissue growth. Our goal is to optimize fish bioenergetics and in so doing, maximize the rate of growth or somatic tissue accumulation that we can. Factors that negatively impact the bioenergetics have been scientifically determined, and they are the same things identified by aquatic animal welfare advocates as important to them. I suggest that while fish farmers may do things for different reasons than animal welfare advocates, in the end, what we do achieves what animal welfare advocates promote. We want to reduce stress and secure good aquatic animal growth within the limits provided by our aquatic environment. And of course, we must also comply with food safety, environmental stewardship, and employee safety requirements. One of the best and simplest measures for good welfare comes from the feed conversion ratio metric. This measure integrates almost everything important to the individual fish and to the population of fish. And most importantly, it has the advantage of being objective. Feed conversion ratio is calculated as feed given divided by fish weight gain. Feed conversion ratio is the mathematical relationship between the input of the feed that has been fed and the weight gain of a population, particularly at harvest. It accounts for mortality and for wasted feed. For feed conversion to be good, there must be good water quality, limited stress, and good nutrition. Operational activities such as fish sorting or hauling must be conducted to minimize fish stress. Waste management practices must ensure good water quality and environmental conditions. Fish health must be good. Feed delivery must be measured and evenly distributed. While feed conversion must be a site-specific metric, it provides a quantifiable measure of success, whether you're concerned with bioenergetics or animal welfare or both. The factors impacting feed conversion are well known, and these can be analyzed to identify weaknesses and modified as appropriate. In the United States, there are not specific federal or state requirements that certain practices be instituted to ensure farmed aquatic animal welfare standards are embraced. I would argue there's no need. While science has led the way to good bioenergetic husbandry practices, in so doing, that science has also provided for good welfare practices. Combined with feeding or federal discharge limitations under the Clean Water Act and food safety requirements on the U.S. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or if you're farmed catfish, the USDA, the USDA FSIS requirements, we really do provide safe, environmentally sustainable seafood raised with good aquatic animal welfare. For those that want more assurance, I suggest you consider the Global Aquaculture Alliance Best Aquaculture Practice or similar certifications. Clear Springs Foods is certified under the program, under the GAA program, and GAA, with some exception, focuses on functional welfare measures. For my part, I welcome those in the animal welfare community who offer new ideas that would help us improve the bioenergetics of fish production on our farms. Thank you.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, like 3 minutes. So I'm going to go to the one that's probably the biggest question we got, which is based on the presentations. In light of or in spite of the science, what is our moral obligation to consider fish welfare? And I'll put that one to Randy and or Howard to handle, if you would like to.
The moral obligation, that is a very complicated and cultural question that I would argue each person has to determine for themselves. I would argue that regardless of the morality of good welfare, the need to provide good welfare for aquatic animals, that we do provide good welfare. So for those that are concerned about the morality of fish farming or of welfare, we do it. We do it now.
Howard, do you want to add anything?
Well, you know, I mean, it's the morality aspect of it is a societal choice. You know, and I agree on a personal level, each person can make their own choices based on their own worldview. As a society, you know, then it becomes a societal choice and open for debate. But, you know, people have to eat something. And one could ask the same question about any food production, any system of food production. You know, whether it's fish, terrestrial farm animals, or plants. To grow plants, you have to displace other animals, kill billions of insects. So, you know, it's a huge question. I think each person has to make that choice for themselves. As scientists, what our role is to help society by providing information to support any decisions. And as aquaculturists or commercial growers, I think that the people who are doing that are participated in this webinar have expressed their views quite well.
So with that, we just hit the 1 hour mark, and we did say we were going to stick to a hard 1 hour timeline. Yeah, I'd just like to give a special thanks to Randy, Howard, and Ben for taking the time to put together their presentations, and Ben for pre-recording it. And Howard, those of us in the US are getting ready. We've still got most of our day to go, but you have a good night.
Thanks.
All right. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. I'll go ahead and shut her down.